We're using this old project to see how could we layer in another complementary color. Orange with blue together is going to create even more of a dark value than just pure blue. We have a sphere, you can kind of see the core shadow. I'm going to emphasize it and make it really obvious for you guys. So when you do complementary colors, you're not doing like one object blue, one object orange. You're going to see how you can use the two of them together. So see how by using blue with the orange, I created a much darker value. Could I do the same thing with the cast shadow? Absolutely. Cast shadow is a little bit thick. There's a little bit of paint. I can almost feel it on top. This painting is a few years old. There's a lot of paint built up there, which is different from over here where you can still see the paper through it. I have a much bigger range of values because that orange was as dark as it could be before, for sure. Because I showed you that was the max amount of orange that was on the paper. So now I went over it with blue, and the blue I'm going over with is just like this, right? You can see it kind of started mixing. It got a little bit of the orange in the brush. But that was not a huge amount of paint. The orange was already so solid, a little bit of blue mixing together, and all of a sudden I have a much more dramatic cast shadow. When you look at it from farther away, that 3D effect is a lot more obvious. So right here, this object is kind of behind this one, and I layer this over. That shadow, that little bit of blue, definitely made it go backwards, and it got me a darker shadow. Now that I have the blue on the cast shadow right here, doesn't this look like it's missing something? When you overlap colors to make a new value, because the cast shadow and the core shadow, remember when you did your formula, cast shadow and core shadows are generally the same value. Now I need to come in here. But even just that little bit of blue, I can keep the orange on for the reflected light. But just because I have this now, this makes more sense with the cast shadow. That's just showing you how you can work them both together. You got a much more 3D effect going on, much bigger range of values. So we're back to our vase. So we're gonna show you next steps, how you could do a little bit more with the red still. Once it's dry, you can kind of make that decision and work it a little bit more, add another layer of red, and then how to kind of go next level with adding in your complement. In this instance, I'm going to add some green. Two things, your tub water, make sure you're changing that regularly, because if you're doing a painting for a while and you're rinsing out your brush in between like you should, your water is going to become colored. So you're not going to get just a pure water if you're trying to do wet on wet or anything. And while you're painting, don't leave your paintbrushes in water, brush side down. If your brush is, kind of doing this and it's like bent, when it dries, it'll start losing its edge and your brush will start doing stuff like this. Especially these smaller ones, if these are point down in the water for a long time, you're going to lose that sharp precision point. If you're doing this with your paint, and if the paint brush is kind of almost like sticking, to it, you can't just take the paint straight off of this onto there without it being a little thick. So grab a little bit of water, diluting it here. If this isn't dark enough, like if I added too much water to it, grab some more paint. But the trick is, I'm just going to come over here kind of to the side, and then I'm going to just grab the teeniest amount of water and then dilute it there. If I add it to all of the water, it's going to take a lot longer. I do want to make sure you guys understand this. Right here, this is also, kind of what not to do. Sometimes people are like, okay, I'm in a hurry, the project's due. I'm just going to avoid the edge, and I'm going to make my cast shadow here. But what happens is that light part, it's going to end up looking like a halo effect. Right now, this part is as bright as my highlight part. And if this is a believable three-dimensional object, there's no way this can be that bright. So you can't leave a gap of white of the paper or anything like that. When you're working on objects, you have to go right up to the edge of it. Let's see how we can use green. Grab a little bit of water, dilute some of it over here. Grab a little bit more paint, make that kind of darker over here. So I have a little bit of a range, even just on my palette. But you can see how this value is definitely darker than just red alone. This is a lot more green. So your goal is to create lots of different values. Add a little bit of green, especially where I have my darkest shadow. We can kind of feather this out. So what would happen if I added, say if I got uncomfortable and I said, that's too much green, can I add more red to it? Yes, but you probably want to wait for it to dry. If I wanted to come back and make a hint of red at the end, I could. But right now, this is definitely gonna help me get a darker value. You do need areas where red and green are layered. You are not just doing this. This is what not to do. This object's red, this object's green. Because then we're just kind of doing a coloring book. So if I were to continue that and just make it green, that's really not the goal. So I would do all 3 objects with some red, like I did with these 2. And then I'm going to come back with green, and I'm going to layer it over in certain areas. Can there be some parts that are just pure green? Sure. So if I wanted to add a little bit of green, over here on the vase, where it's a little bit lighter, I can definitely do that. I can put just green right here. And then it'll kind of flow into the red. So if I want to have some part that's just green, I can absolutely do that. But what you want to remember is that cool colors are going to go backwards visually. So the green right here, it's also a darker value, but it's also helping it make like it's curving down and away from me by putting it right there. If I put a little bit of a cool color up in here, we add that in. As I'm painting, I'm probably going to have more areas that are just red than I am just green because of my workflow, because I did red first. Some of these lighter areas, I like how they look just red, but I do need to come back and then add another layer of value with the green, whether it's in here, even if it's real subtle, it doesn't have to be a lot. See how that accentuated that and just like deepened that shadow, just a hint of green. So it doesn't have to be this obvious. It can be kind of subtle like that. One thing though that I would do, because I tend to like to finish my projects off with a little bit of a background. We haven't really talked about backgrounds yet. First off, you're gonna put a background. It's kind of just basically like a horizon line. You can put it wherever you want to that makes sense to you. You can't make it down here because then this object would be floating. I would suggest not putting it way up there because then it's gonna look awkward that the desk is way over there. Somewhere around here is gonna be kind of the most aesthetically pleasing for me. Put in this. Try and keep it somewhat even or level. So now I'm going to finish this off with a background. When you do your backgrounds, if you choose to do them, you don't have to, but if you want to add one, first be real careful on your edges. Do it towards the end part of your project, and you got to make sure all those edges are 100% dry. They cannot be wet or it's going to leak into it. But remember, part of the beauty of complements is that if I want my object to show off the redness of it, let's say, green is going to offset it. One of the easier ways to start a background is to start with a concentration of like a background and it's going to fade out. So I'm going to start with one edge here. We're going to do a wet on wet technique. I'm kind of tracing right up to my edge. And then I'm going to get this part a little wet too. It's not drippy wet, just kind of damp. I'm going to take a relatively light green and drop that in. This is pretty subtle. Before it dries, you definitely need to kind of drag out the edge like that and soften the edge. And this is real subtle, you can barely see it. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to start with like the darker value here. I'm going to come right up to the edge and then pull it off from there. It's wet on wet, so it is going to spread, but I am going to help it move away from the object. And this is a background like, shadow. So shadows and light are going to move and travel and diffuse. So it's okay. It doesn't need to be even. It can be kind of shifting from darker to lighter, which is kind of the nice way to start this. So that's why I said it's kind of an easier way. You definitely don't want a dark outline. Sometimes that happens as I'm talking and demonstrating. I slow down as I'm talking and I kind of end up with that. So see how this is kind of like dark and then it kind of goes dark to light. I definitely don't want it to look like it's an outline of this object. I gotta come in here and I can either drop down a little bit more of the paint or just help it move around. And like I said, it's okay if it's a little diffused because the properties of light are like that. It's going to be lighter and darker as the light and shadow travel. If I say, okay, I need a little bit more here, but I got to keep track. What is my paper? Is this paint going to travel or is it going to stay put? Kind of come right along. You can always add more. If I wanted to make this whole thing a little bit darker, I could definitely come in here and make all of this a little bit darker. As you're doing backgrounds, you do have to work quickly, but you can see that green really kind of makes the red pop. It ties that in to where the green on the objects actually makes sense. So we get kind of a whole concept of unity in our object, and our whole painting is kind of coming together and making sense now. You have to have cast shadows. You need to be able to see highlight and shadow. This is two-dimensional, this is flat. So I need to try and make something that's three-dimensional, two-dimensional. So when I look at real objects, I have to translate three-dimensional into two-dimensional. And that's a process for me that I have to learn and figure out how to do. If I take a picture of it, the picture is already two-dimensional. I'm already seeing space as a two-dimensional thing. If these are on a photo, I can see this is up higher and this is lower and all that. If I'm looking at the objects live in person, I have to figure out the spatial relationships between these, the depth. I have to figure out where the shadows are on the cast shadow. It will actually help you very much in the long run in terms of developing your eye in terms of space and shadow and form. So it is real important to do it. All right, you're gonna do still life, 2 colors, but they have to be complements. So here's your color choices: yellow and purple, orange and blue, green and red. All right, have fun, and we'll see you in the next video.